The most famous jewel in the entire world is a lie, and if you go to the Tower of London right now, you'll see lines of tourists snaking around the block just waiting to catch a glimpse of it. They're waiting to see the Imperial State Crown, which is a towering masterpiece of wealth and authority dripping with 3,000 diamonds, pearls, and sapphires, but your eye doesn't care about the diamonds. Your eye goes instantly to the center, to that glowing blood-red heart of the crown that they call the Black Prince's Ruby. It's the size of a chicken egg, polished but uncut, retaining the raw, heavy shape it had when it was torn from the earth 7 centuries ago, and it looks like a drop of solidified blood. Legend says it was worn by kings on the battlefield, soaked in the sweat of tyrants and the reign of Agincourt, making it the ultimate symbol of the British monarchy's endurance. But there's a massive problem that most of those tourists will never know, because the stone isn't a ruby at all. It's an imposter that's been sitting on the throne of England for hundreds of years, enjoying the adoration of the masses while hiding a chemical secret. Tonight we're going to dismantle the legend of the Black Prince's Ruby by looking past the velvet and the guards and the bulletproof glass to find the forensic truth hidden inside the stone. This is a story about a case of mistaken identity that lasted for 400 years, involving the ghost of a dead kingdom and the specific moment when science finally caught up with royalty. Let's start with the crime scene itself, because the stone isn't faceted like a modern gem you'd see in a ring today. It's a cabochon, a smooth, rounded lump that glows with a deep, sinister red, and if you look closely, you'll see a tiny gold cap sitting on top of it. That's because at some point in the Middle Ages, someone actually drilled a hole right through it so they could wear it as a pendant. Imagine that. A gemstone so valuable that wars were fought over it, and someone took a drill to it like it was a common glass bead. Later, a smaller genuine ruby was shoved into the hole to plug it up, which is a scar on the stone's face and a permanent reminder that before it was a national treasure, it was just loot. The history of this stone reads like a screenplay written by a psychopath, and it enters the historical record in 1366 in the hands of a man named Don Pedro the Cruel. That wasn't an ironic nickname, by the way, because Don Pedro was the king of Castile and he was losing a vicious civil war against his own brother. He needed money and soldiers, but he didn't have the cash, so he turned to a guest, the Moorish prince Abu Said of Granada. Abu Said had come to Don Pedro to discuss a peace treaty, bringing his servants, his entourage, and his vast collection of jewelry. Don Pedro invited the prince to dinner, poured him wine, and spoke of friendship, but when the guards were in place, he had the prince and his entire retinue stabbed to death. Don Pedro didn't do this for political strategy. He did it for the loot, stripping the corpse of the prince himself to find a massive red stone hidden in his robes. That stone was the Black Prince's Ruby, and it entered European history dripping with the blood of a murder victim. But Don Pedro couldn't keep it because he still needed an army. So he called on the greatest mercenary of the age, Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, known to history as the Black Prince. Edward was a terrifying figure, a man who burned villages for sport and wore black armor that made him look like a shadow on the battlefield. Edward saved Don Pedro's kingdom, and when it came time for payment, he didn't want gold, he wanted the stone. He took it back to England, but the victory was cursed. Edward contracted a wasting disease in Spain that slowly rotted him from the inside out for 9 long years until his death in 1376. The stone didn't save him, it just moved on to the next owner. The most famous moment in the stone's life came in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt, where King Henry V, the warrior poet of Shakespeare's plays, wore the stone on his helmet. Picture the scene where the English are outnumbered 5-1 and the French knights are charging through the mud. Henry stands his ground, the great red stone flashing on his head like a target, when the Duke of Alençon fights his way through the melee and swings a massive battle axe straight at the king's head. The axe connects, shearing off part of the gold crown and denting the helmet, but the stone holds. Henry survives, he wins the battle, and the legend is born of the ruby that protects the king. For centuries, no one questioned it, and it was listed in the royal inventories as the Great Ruby, the envy of every monarch in Europe. But then came the Enlightenment in the late 1700s when the world changed and we stopped looking at rocks as magical talismans and started looking at them as chemical compounds. Men like Jean-Baptiste Louis Romet de Lille started applying the laws of geometry to crystals, realizing that nature isn't random but follows specific rules. And the rules for rubies are very specific, which is where the mask slips and the imposter gets caught. To understand why the Black Prince's ruby is a fake, you have to understand the fundamental difference between corundum and spinel. A true ruby is a variety of the mineral corundum, and its chemical formula is aluminum oxide, Al2O3. It's simple, elegant, and incredibly hard, sitting at a 9 on the Mohs scale of hardness, making it the second hardest thing on the planet after diamond. But the most important thing about a ruby is its shape, because corundum grows in the trigonal crystal system. That means it forms hexagonal prisms, so if you find a raw ruby in the dirt in Burma, it looks like a 6-sided barrel. Because of that structure, rubies are doubly refractive, meaning when light enters a ruby, it splits into two separate rays. This is called pleochrism, so if you look at a ruby from one angle, it looks purplish red, but turn it slightly, and it looks orangey red. It's a complex shifting interaction with light that gives the ruby its signature depth and fire. Now let's look at the imposter, because the Black Prince's stone is spinel. Spinel is chemically more complex, composed of magnesium aluminum oxide Mgal2O4. It's softer than a ruby, sitting at an 8 on the Mohs scale, and while that might not sound like a huge difference, in the world of geology, the gap between an 8 and a 9 is massive. A ruby will scratch a spinel every single time, but the smoking gun isn't the hardness, it's the geometry. Spinel grows in the cubic crystal system, forming octahedrons, which are perfect double pyramids that look like two four-sided pyramids glued together at the base. It's the same crystal system as a diamond, and because it's cubic, spinel is singly refractive. It doesn't split the light, and it doesn't change colors when you turn it, possessing a flat, consistent optical purity. So why did they confuse them for so long? Because nature is a trickster, and rubies and spinels grow in the exact same places. They are formed in the same metamorphic marble deposits, so if you go to the legendary mines of Mogok in Myanmar, or the ancient mines of Badakhshan in modern-day Tajikistan, you find them sitting right next to each other in the gravel. The miners in the 1300s didn't have refractometers or mass spectrometers. They had their eyes. They saw a bright red stone that came out of the ruby mines, and they called it a ruby. They actually had a name for these specific stones, calling them Balas Rubies. The word Balas comes from Balasia, which was the ancient name for the region of Badakhshan. For 1,000 years, the Balas ruby was just considered a different type of ruby, maybe a little softer or brighter, but part of the same family. It wasn't until 1783 that the mineralogist Rome de Lille proved that they were fundamentally different species. He showed that the angles of the crystals were constant and distinct, proving that a spinel could never be a ruby, no matter how red it was. Imagine the awkward conversation at the palace when that news broke, telling the king that the priceless ruby in the center of the crown, the one Henry V wore at Agincourt, is actually magnesium, a semi-precious stone. In a different world, they might have ripped it out and replaced it with a real ruby to save face. But the British monarchy understands one thing better than anyone else: the power of the story. They kept the spinel, and they didn't even change the name. To this day, the tour guides at the Tower of London will tell you about the Black Prince's ruby, and you have to read the fine print to see the word spinel. But here's the twist. In the modern world, the imposter has become a hero. For a long time, spinel was known as the poor man's ruby, the stone you bought if you couldn't afford the real thing. But gemologists and collectors have started to realize something. Spinel is actually much rarer than ruby. Fine rubies are rare, yes, but nature produces way more corundum than it does gem-quality red spinel. And unlike rubies, which are almost always heat-treated to improve their color, spinel is naturally perfect. It comes out of the ground looking like that. The Black Prince's ruby hasn't been cooked in an oven, filled with lead glass, or irradiated. It is a raw, honest piece of the earth. There is a fascinating irony here because the ruby turned out to be a fake, but the fake turned out to be more pure than the real thing. We often think of science as something that destroys mystery, believing that by analyzing the chemical bonds of a stone, we strip away its magic. But I don't think that's true. When I look at the Black Prince's ruby now, I don't see a failed ruby. I see a survivor. I see a stone that fooled kings and a crystal structure of magnesium aluminum oxide that managed to bluff its way into the most exclusive club on Earth. I see a cubic crystal masquerading in a trigonal world. It teaches us that value is subjective. Is the stone valuable because it's a ruby, or is it valuable because Don Pedro murdered a prince for it? Is it valuable because of its refractive index, or because it deflected an axe blow in 1415? The Black Prince's ruby sits in the cross-pate of the Imperial State Crown, staring out at the modern world. It has seen empires rise and fall, the invention of gunpowder, the steam engine, and the nuclear bomb. It has seen the birth of chemistry and the death of alchemy, and through it all, it kept it secret. It sat there, glowing with that deep, cubic, singly refractive fire, laughing at the monarchs who thought they owned it. It reminds us that we don't really own these things, we are just their temporary caretakers. The stone was here long before us, forged in the crushing tectonic pressure of the Earth's crust, and it will be here long after the crown has rusted and the tower has crumbled. The imposter outlived the truth, so the next time you look at a piece of jewelry, ask yourself what you're really seeing. Are you seeing the stone, or are you seeing the story? Are you seeing the label, or are you seeing the lattice? The world is full of imposters. Some of them are in our crowns and some of them are in our pockets. And the only way to tell the difference is to stop listening to the legend and start looking at the light. This confusion between red gems goes even deeper than just the British crown. Throughout history, the Balas Ruby was traded along the Silk Road, confusing merchants from Venice to Beijing. Marco Polo himself wrote about the ruby mines of Badakhshan, likely never realizing he was actually describing Spinel mines. This wasn't a localized mistake. It was a global delusion that lasted for nearly a millennium. Think about the sheer number of crowns, scepters, and reliquaries sitting in European museums right now that haven't been tested. How many other rubies are actually imposters waiting to be outed by a simple refractometer test? The Catherine the Great ruby in Russia, also a Spinel, the Timur ruby, Spinel, the Timur. It seems that for centuries, the world's most powerful people preferred the imposter without even knowing it, and perhaps there is a reason for that beyond just the color. Spinel has a higher clarity than ruby. It doesn't have the silk and the inclusions that cloud a ruby's interior. It is brighter, sharper, and in a candlelit throne room, maybe that brilliance matters more than the chemical formula. It's almost as if the stone wanted to be found, wanted to be worn, and used its mimicry as a survival tactic. In biology, we call it Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species evolves to look like a dangerous one to survive. Here, we have a mineral evolving, or rather forming, to look like the most precious substance on Earth so that it would be dug up, polished, and worshipped. It worked. The Black Princess Spinel has survived revolutions that melted down other crowns for their gold. It survived the English Civil War, where the crown jewels were destroyed, yet somehow this stone resurfaced. It carries a luck that defies probability. Maybe that's the true power of the stone, not protection from axes, but protection from obscurity. It demands we look closer at the things we take for granted. We accept the names given to things, ruby, diamond, king, queen, without checking the structure underneath. But the structure is the only thing that's real. The atoms don't lie. The geometry doesn't lie. The octahedron is an absolute truth in a world of relative descriptions. So when you subscribe to Mystic Apothecary, you aren't just joining a channel about pretty rocks, you are joining a movement to reclaim the truth from the myths. We are the new alchemists, not trying to turn lead into gold, but trying to turn legend into fact. If you want to learn how to spot the imposters in your own collection, or if you just love the dark history of the things we pull from the ground, you need to subscribe to Mystic Apothecary right now. We don't just admire the shine, we examine the structure. Click the like button if you're Team Spinel, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.